Hello and welcome to ClockTower Game Studios. Today we're going to be doing part 3 of the NeoNagoya Koban, or Japanese-inspired police station build. As you can see, we're ready to move on to the second floor. The building itself is scratch built, made from foam core. If you haven't been keeping up with the series, you can always go check out the backlog of videos. There's a couple of early ones, but we're going to be using the foam core building material combined with details that are 3D printed on a 3D resin SLA printer, the Elegoo Mars. The models, like the car you see there, as well as most of the office furniture, is from Titan Forge Miniatures, and then some of the details like the window frames and the doors themselves and the walk-up window on the bottom floor I made myself on Tinkercad. And then I went and found some Japanese posters and stuff for detailing. So moving forward, please excuse any white balance issues you see. Working on that, ordered some new lights. They should be here sometime, hopefully in the next week or so. I did get one of them today, but I only got to make use of it a little bit. So to begin with, we're going to start with our floor texture, which I'm using a marble hex tile that looks like a nice marble. I really liked the texture itself as well as the design. I thought it had both a sci-fi and kind of a classic look all at once. It also had a nice geometric pattern that lent itself really well to being able to make sure it was nice and even and straightly mounted to the foam core. You'll note I only traced around part of the floor. I'm not making it to where the entire second floor is visible. I just want the front office area where I've envisioned it being like the detective's offices or homicide's office or whatever, the specific department. Anyway, I'm just making that part visible, so I've only done the small section instead of the whole floor. So now I'm just going to use my glue stick, my plain Elmer's like school glue stick. I'm using a backing so I don't get the glue all over my mat. And then you start at the center and work towards the edge. This keeps it from curling the page too much, and it also makes sure that you get the glue all the way to the edge of the paper. And this is just printed on my home printer. It's nothing fancy. You don't need to like go to Office Depot or anything and have it cut like high-end printed. It's just typical printer paper with a typical printer. It's nothing terribly exciting, like I said. So now I'm gonna line it up using the edge, and like I said, the hex pattern really makes this nice and easy because it's got the single line of straight edges that goes all the way across it. And once I've got it in place, I just rub it on, try and get all the air bubbles out from under it, make sure it's seated fully and seated all the way out to the edges. That way it bonds nice and tight to get us started. After we've got the floor texture secured, the next thing to do is to get the window frames cut in and glued into place. So these are the 3D printed window frames that go on the outside. I made these in a two-part, so they have a lip on the inside of the outer frame, the one that goes on the outside of the wall, and that's so I can actually use a piece of clear plastic packaging to make an actual window, because I want this to be sealed so players can't actually put models in there, even if they can see in and touch, you know, the outside. I don't want them to be able to reach the inside at all. It's meant to be seen but not actually played. So with that in mind, I'm just going to secure these window frames into place. I'm starting with just plain Elmer's PVA, and I just spread it on with a little piece of cardstock that was a piece of scrap from where I cut the railings. So I get that all smoothed in, and then I'm just going to mount the window frame in there just the same. Now, I couldn't use hot glue for this because this is all going to be visible, so I needed it to be a lot more tidy. That's why, unlike the bottom floor where I just use hot glue for everything, I'm using PVA for this side. So now that we've done one, I'm just going to wipe it clean, and then I'm going to go ahead and skip to the next part. So since most of the basic construction process of this is the same as what it was on the first floor, I figured I'd skip ahead a little and go to the more advanced stuff, like doing the window cut-ins for the clear plastic, and then the stuff like you saw in the little demo model I just did, which is actually the interior wall that divides off this section from the rest of the building, how that had some of the touches of life, as I call them, the little details like the clock and the poster. So this is going to be starting with how to do the windows the way I do to get the clear you know, it kind of emulates glass. So first, on the outside of the window frame, this is the inner part, but the outside side of it, the part that'll actually be visible from the outside of the building. Just take super glue and very carefully around the edges of it, add just a few dots along each edge. You don't want to go all the way across this because super glue, when glued to clear plastic, will give off a fume, which will result in kind of a smoky white residue that shows up on the clear plastic. You can skip that a little bit by, if you buy, I can't remember what brand it is, but there's a company that makes what's called canopy glue for model airplanes and that sort of thing. And what that is it's a super glue designed specifically for this purpose that won't leave a bunch of fumes and won't leave those marks. However, in the open like this, as long as you don't go excessive with the glue, you should be fine and it shouldn't leave too many marks. So there, I just glued that on and I'm weighting it down so it stays completely flat. And then I'm gonna move on to something else and work on something else while that's drying. And while we're waiting on that to dry, I'm gonna go ahead and get started on what I decided to call the touches of life for the model. So the first thing I wanted to do is get out some of my bits that I printed off onto my paper, and I've got some like actual Japanese documents and some anime characters, and I've got the one big section there in the top right is actual newspaper covers. So the itty bitty spot right there that I'm cutting out now is actually an anime character that I decided would be this particular person's screensaver. Like I said, I'm just going with this being heavily influenced by Japanese culture and tastes. I figured that would be a good way to go. So I'm going to trim off as much of the excess of this paper as I can. I'm being very careful and using my hobby knife. After I was satisfied with how much of that I got trimmed off, I just got my glue stick back out. I did a test piece to make sure that this wouldn't mess up any kind of plastic if I glued it to the clear plastic, but then I used my hobby knife to pick it up, put it on the end of the glue stick, slide it off, and now I'm just going to slide it straight onto the monitor where I've already got the screen painted white. So I'm just going to get that slid into position. You have a little bit of play once you get it in place. The glue doesn't dry right away. It's a little tacky, so it's hard to slide. But as you can see, I just used the tip of my hobby knife and pushed it around a little bit. That way I didn't have to put pressure directly on the surface of the piece of art and cause the page to stick. And then once I had it where I was happy with it, I used the side of the hobby knife and then my thumb to just push it into position. And then I noticed there's a little bit of overhang, so I go back in with my hobby knife and just trim it up a little bit more. And there, as you can see, once it was done, I got the characters set into place and trimmed up to where it's just off to the right-hand side, kind of like a background or a screensaver. So for the rest of the touches of life, I'm going to focus on just this desk. I've spread them more throughout the rest of the room, but I figured focusing on just the desk will kind of show you how I did a couple of different effects, and will be a lot cleaner than showing every single thing that I built. So next I'm doing some desk clutter, and I've started with one of the newspapers, and now I'm working on a couple of the legal documents. So what I decided I was going to do here is, since my overall theme for NeoNagoya is that it's a very recently evacuated urban sprawl, I want to kind of imply that life is there very recently, that it's very recently inhabited. So what I've decided is this particular desk has got some desk clutter on it, paperwork that was being filed or whatever, a copy of the newspaper, and then a spilled can of soda on it. So for the paper, initially I'm just going to do the exact same thing. The only thing that I'm doing any kind of different here is I'm folding up the newspaper, since it was a big thing, like it's kind of a big sheet, and I'm making sure that the front cover is visible, and I'm just giving it some folds so it looks like it's actually like a thick newspaper that's folded up and laid aside on the desk. The rest of the papers I'm doing just like I did with the screensaver. So all these printed off images, including the newspaper, are just going to be raked across the top of the glue stick and then stuck in place where I want them. So I've got the newspaper folded up. I'm going to go ahead and get started with it. and I just want to unfold it a little bit and glue the inside of it so it'll help it keep it folded as it dries. So I did the legal documents the same way as I did the newspaper. I just used the glue stick, stuck them on, and then I'm gonna move on to the soda can. So my girlfriend made these out of polymer clay. I've also used a round toothpick or cocktail sticks in the past. You just have to paint them. The polymer clay has the advantage of already being painted, and I kind of liked the way the purple stands out against all of the other kind of drab colors. It seemed like an appropriate branding thing to do. So now I've got my purple can, and I'm just going to glue it in place. I just used super glue. I'm gluing it to where the opened end will be pointed towards the legal documents after I get to that part of the painting. I just use the end of my toothpick there to clean up the excess super glue a little bit. I don't want to leave a big nasty pool obvious on the model. So once both the stick glue and the super glue on the desktop itself has had a little bit of a chance to set up and dry, I go ahead and swap out my gear for painting stuff. And I'm just using craft paints for the majority of this because I don't like using high-end model paints like the high-end acrylics on terrain. I feel like it's wasteful, and you can usually get what you're looking for because it doesn't have to be as perfect. You can usually get the effect you're looking for using the hobby paints. So this is just, I think it's an Apple Barrel or a Plaid brand hobby paint. It's just a metallic silver. And I'm just painting what would be the top and the bottom of the can. And then I'm just going to double check and make sure I'm happy with the silver and move on to painting the actual mouth of the can. So now I've just got some Army Painter black, and I'm just very carefully putting the appearance of a hole or an opening, the drinking spout, in the top of the can. Finished with that, it's time to move on to the actual staining where it looks like the soda was spilled. So I'm just using some homemade brown wash. This was made with a recipe very similar to Jeremy from Black Magic Crafts. He's another YouTuber that does a lot of these sorts of videos. He does more fantasy-based stuff and is a much more popular YouTuber. If you're not familiar with him, I highly suggest going and checking out his channel. He's a really cool guy and his content's amazing. Definitely give him a look if you haven't before. So anyway, here I've got my homemade wash. It's kind of a brown inky kind of wash. And I just soak it into those two legal documents, and I make sure it pools around them right outside the front of the can. And I made sure to get a little bit back alongside the can. And then after I was satisfied with that, the next step is to make the monitor stand out so it doesn't just look like more plain matte white, and the screensaver doesn't just blend in and get lost in it. And it doesn't just look like more paper glued to the top of the desk, which is supposed to look like paper, admittedly, but this is supposed to look like a computer screen. So I'm using Games Workshop Citadel's gloss varnish. I don't even know if this product's available anymore. I know they have other varnishes and finishes that they sell now, but basically any gloss varnish will do. And I just paint it on there, nice couple even coats, make sure I don't leave any brush marks in it. And once that's in there, it'll give that screen a nice glossy look, and it'll help blend in that character on the screensaver. And with the desk finished, it's time to move on back to the window. So this has had a chance to dry, and now I'm just going to trim off all that extra clear plastic. So the reason I did it this way instead of trying to use the smallest piece possible and then glue it down once it was cut to size is this makes it a lot easier to get the exact sizing and to actually handle the clear plastic. I found it kind of difficult whenever I was doing testing and getting a feel for it. I found that just cutting it directly to size was a much easier process. So just trim it off nice and carefully. Depending on the plastic you're using, you'll probably have to take a couple slow cuts like I am here. I'm just being real patient, taking my time. I'm trying not to tear or bend the plastic overly much or dig too much into the window frame. I'm just taking my time being careful. So after getting the glass cut into place, the next step is to attach it to the front of the frame, which is the part that goes into the outer wall. So there you can see it just kind of drops in nice and even, slots right in. Fortunately, I got lucky with a couple of these prints and they turned out really nice. So I'm just going to take my super glue, and the same thing, I don't want to cause that fogging residue, so I'm just going to take the super glue, put a few dots along each edge. I want this to be a little more secure, since if a player or somebody pokes at the glass, I don't want it to just pop right out. Getting into the building after that to put it back into place would be a pain, so I want to try and make this as secure as possible without causing any of that fog. So I'm just going around real carefully and touching it up. After the glue spread out pretty evenly, the next thing to do is to just drop in the inner frame, and you do that with the glass, the clear plastic, facing towards the outer wall. And I just push that in there, and I'm using my thumbnail to kind of make sure it's secured. I'm not pressing on the clear plastic itself, I'm pressing on the outer frame, the frame that it's mounted to. So as you can see, you can actually tell that there's something there, but I'm just going to go around now and clean up and make sure there's no super glue on the outer surface of the glass. And it looks pretty good. You can see the blinds through it, and the next step is to paint up the frame. So since I've already done an in-depth build video, I'm not going to spend a lot of time focused on it here. There's one thing that I'd like to point out since the build went the way it did, and that's the paint caused the interior walls to warp and flex inward. So you'll be able to see that here in a few minutes as the video goes on. But I ended up having to use a bunch of pins to try and straighten it out, and it didn't end up being exactly perfect. But here you can see I just used a lot of the same materials and processes that I used in the first floor. I used a hot glue gun, I used my square to make sure everything was as true as I could get it. Because of the warping on the two long walls especially, it was really a pain to get everything as square as I wanted. So I'm going to go ahead and move ahead to the part where I started pinning stuff and trying to get it to stay in place. So at this point, I've already got the two short walls glued into place, which is going to give me a nice square base to build off of. And now I'm just getting the glue onto the long wall, the first long wall I'm putting in. So I know already that it's going to be warped, and I'm using PVA because that'll give me a little more working time. And since I don't want the mess of the hot glue underneath the front side where you can see it, that's another reason I'm sticking with the PVA for the front. So now I know this is warped, and I know I'm going to have to push the middle section in. So I start by, from the bottom through my base, I pin in my front corner. And I do this as carefully as possible. I try to make sure my fingers are out of the way. I'm bracing at the top of the wall, not the sides. And there you can see how bad that bow is on the outside. So there I've just got it pinned at the front. So since pinning from the bottom is pretty straightforward, I went ahead and skipped showing that part. So what I'm doing now is I've added some more glue along the inside of that joint, and I'm just cleaning up the mess. It's okay if a little of it gets onto the paint that they'll actually see whenever you're playing. And that's because it'll dry clear, and behind the glossy windows and everything, you won't really be able to tell it's even there. So pinning the walls in the middle from the top like this is a lot more difficult. So you have to start by pushing the pin down at an angle from one side or the other. I chose from the inside out, and you want to form an X with these. So you do two pins, and you do one from the outer material to the inner material, and you do one from the inner to the outer, and you make sure they cross. And that X will help brace that in place and keep that joint solid. So between those two sets of pins, the ones through the bottom of the base and then the one in the top of the wall, that'll help keep that whole structure solid at the front half. And I'm just going to use hot glue since I can, and just make it as solid as possible at the back. I basically just coat the inside of the back in hot glue at this point. And here you can see I've done the second side the exact same as I did the first. I made the same X, and after I've finished with it, I go back in and I start reinforcing everything with more hot glue to help keep it in place and help the PVA have a good chance to bond. And I'm just going to go around and solid the whole thing up like that. Now that the two long walls are in and the front is open, I decided before I enclose the front, the next thing to do would be to start getting the furniture glued into place and arranged in the interior. So I start with the part that goes farthest back and work my way forward. So I've got this small filing cabinet that has a document on top of it and a poster on the side. And I just use super glue for all this. So I glue this one to the wall as well as to the floor. That'll help give a little bit of extra reinforcement to both just that bad joint on the exterior wall, and it'll help keep this thing in place. So I use super glue for all this. I just go from the back to the front and I start checking my angles. I want to make sure everything's centered when I get to the pieces that go in the middle of the floor, and just slowly work my way forward. And then once I've got the furniture all in place, it's time to start gluing on the front panels of the kind of the gabled front there. So I start with the very front one because I figure it's going to be the easiest one to square, and I just follow the same steps. This only starts to get tricky when I'm having to force in the two side slots. They were a little bit more finicky because they didn't quite fit perfectly because of the warpage with the painting. But the same thing as the two long sides, just pin everything in place. It'll hold it all, and just take your time, work to get everything to where you want it. Don't be afraid to go back and clean up messes of glue like I'm doing here. I got a little bit carried away with the PVA, but I just went back and touched it up. And I do the same thing all the way around this whole project. Just take your time, redo what you need to as you go, and no matter what you're building, as long as you put the time and the effort into it, eventually you'll get what you want. As you can see, by the time I was finished getting the front walls all into place, I had kind of a forest of pins going on there across the front and the bottom. So I wanted to kind of clean up these loose, rough looking joins on the front. So I just took a little bit of my PVA there, and I'm just using my fingers, and I'm kind of smearing it into those crevices and cracks where it didn't quite join up right. And that'll help seal it and make the whole thing a little more sturdy. So I'm just dabbing the glue right on and then wiping my finger across it just to make it more solid and work down into those joins. And I ended up going through and doing a little bit of this from the top and on the inside as well. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching the whole video. As you can see, there's still some things that need worked out as far as the build goes. This was a learning experience for me, and hopefully watching the process and seeing how I tried to tackle some of the obstacles helps you learn as well. The biggest things that I'm unsatisfied with as far as this build goes are definitely the complex joins there around the bay windows. The exterior ended up looking okay, but the interior has some definite issues I'm not happy with. There's some kind of big gaps there. And part of that comes down to I don't have the appropriate tools to be making those kind of mitered cuts, but that's okay. Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with the results. As a piece of gaming terrain that's not really a diorama, it's not really a display piece, it's ultimately going to end up on a game board for demos and for gameplay. This is going to be more than adequate. It's going to look great, it's going to draw attention, and it's going to be everything I want it to be. It's just, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I can see that there's some errors that I want to fix in the future projects. So if you liked the video, if you learned something, go ahead and like it, subscribe to the channel for more. If you want to keep up with all the upcoming NeoNagoya builds, including the finish of this building, be sure to hit the notification bell. Check us out for other updates on our other social medias. Instagram gets daily updates. Twitter gets whenever I'm working on a project like this. I kind of live tweet it as I go. And of course, you can also follow us on Facebook for big announcements, and anytime we share a video, it gets posted there as well. So if you'd like to support us more directly, you can also check us out on Patreon. We have a couple different tiers of support there and monthly rewards that go along with them. Also, you can find us on Buy Me a Coffee, where you can tip us, buy us a couple cups of coffee. That's always appreciated, probably more than anything else. And you can also shop for all the equipment and materials used in these videos in the description below in the Amazon affiliate links. Buying from there, you buy stuff at cost that it would normally be for you, but we get a little bit of a kickback from it. It's a good way to support the channel without having to spend any extra money of your own. Next, of course, I'd like to thank Titan Forge Miniatures for letting us use their materials. This wasn't a paid promotion. They in no way were involved in the making of this video, other than allowing us to use their models and materials in our materials, such as this video and our game. So check them out. I'll have links to them in the description below. I know that showing off office furniture isn't the most exciting way to show off a model company, but one of the cool things is their monthly Patreon that lets you download and use these files to print includes terrain pieces as well as the miniatures, and it's all at a really reasonable price. If you're into 3D printing, they're one of the best miniature Patreons you can subscribe to, in my opinion. You get a lot of content for a really good value. Anyway, be sure to come back on Monday and check out the completion of this build. I'm going to go ahead and try and knock out the exterior and have the video up on time on the normal time. Next month we'll be resuming a more adjusted video posting schedule. Instead of 2 videos a week, I'm just going to be doing 1, and that's so I can turn out more of this terrain and put up more videos that are focused and a little bit more in depth. So next week will be the start of that. There'll only be 1 video next week, but hopefully you come back and check it out. I'm looking forward to finishing this building, and until then, remember, at the Clock Tower, it's always game time.